Our opening thought this morning comes from Jim Wallis and his recent book, The False White Gospel. He writes, "Some national figures, scholars, church leaders, and culture watchers and journalists have been urging us to confront a rising ideology that is rooted in America's original sin, the sin of white supremacy. The armed groups and individuals who are motivated by white supremacy are now judged to be the greatest domestic terrorist threat to our country's security today by many law enforcement authorities. That old ideology of white supremacy is now religiously undergirded by an old heresy with a new name: white Christian nationalism. I believe that white Christian nationalism is the single greatest threat to democracy in America." Our next reading is also from Jim Wallis, The False White Gospel. Practically, the moral and spiritual battle for voting rights to save both democracy and the church will require us all. It means registering to vote and helping others to do so. It might mean getting parishioners to sign up to be a poll worker or volunteer. We need many people to get other people out to the polling places on election days. It will take some of us being trained to become poll chaplains or poll watchers to make sure nothing is going wrong, and to use their training to intervene if something does. It will mean talking about voting rights as a faith issue among your friends and family, in your congregations, and getting your pastor to preach about it from the pulpit. Our next reading, and perhaps you're sensing a theme here, is coming from Jim Wallis, The False White Gospel, where he writes, "It is a very sad day when some of the meanest and most hateful messages in our society are coming from people and groups who call themselves Christians. And therefore, it is vitally important to demonstrate that there is a Christian faith in deep opposition to the partisan agendas of a false, white, wealthy, prideful nationalism and patriarchal religion." It should come as no surprise that the discourse today is Reflections on the False White Gospel by Jim Wallis. We've had 3 readings from him so far. I spent the last 5 weeks leading an online book discussion group on this book, which was really fascinating to hear from persons from all over the United States and also outside of the United States, looking at Jim Wallis's work together. I've had an opportunity to hear him speak in person on a number of occasions at the American Academy of Religion and in some other settings as well. And in the False White Gospel, he's looking at the historical and current expressions of white Christian nationalism in the United States, and he's also reflecting on what he thinks must be done to preserve a multicultural and multiracial participatory democracy. I thought I'd begin just by sharing a little bit about who Jim Wallis is. He just had a birthday this past week on June 4th. He was born in 1948. He's certainly a theologian. He's a writer on numerous topics, maybe most well known as a social and political activist, but he's probably most well known for the fact that he's the founder of the magazine called Sojourners Magazine. A lot of people have heard of that, and he was also the founder of the Washington, D.C. based community that shared that name, Sojourners. Since 2021, he has been a professor, an endowed professor. He holds the Desmond Tutu Chair in Faith and Justice at Georgetown University, and he also is leading a Center for Faith and Justice at Georgetown as well. He's always attempted to eschew political labels, though he is certainly known as someone who is associated with what's called the evangelical left, sometimes called the Christian left. He describes himself as evangelical, realizing that that word has been taken and perhaps usurped by many within our society, but he attempts to bring a new understanding and definition to that word. He's been also the advisor of presidents, including George W. Bush for a very short time until he came out against the war in Iraq, and then he was no longer working with President George W. Bush, and then he also worked as a spiritual advisor with Barack Obama as well. So he's connected to persons who have a significant amount of influence and power within our society. Finally, he's also a leader in what's called the Red Letter Christian movement, which is a movement of progressive Christians who are trying to show that faith and justice are inseparable. Faith and justice are inseparable. In his book, The False White Gospel, Wallis writes about the importance of crossing the color line for him, crossing the color line. He grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and he attended with his family a white evangelical church there. But when he, as a youth, became concerned about the racism that he was witnessing in Detroit, he became very intentional about, as he puts it, crossing the color line, learning about persons who were different than he was, especially persons who were black living in Detroit. And he became very concerned about the blatant and systemic racism that was present in his hometown of Detroit. But he did not find support in addressing those concerns in his white evangelical church community. In fact, he found just the opposite. Here are some responses that Jim Wallis received when, as a young man, he questioned racism in his hometown of Detroit. One response was, quote, "I don't know. That is just the way it is and the way it has always been," end quote. Another response, quote, "If you keep asking those questions, son, you are going to get into trouble," end quote. You notice always the addition of the word son when they're speaking in such a patronizing and from patriarchal perspective. And then finally, son, you have to understand that Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That is politics, end quote. Well, you might guess that Jim Wallis did not find these responses helpful in his white evangelical faith community, and that last response especially is what led Wallis to leave his evangelical church community and to leave the church as a whole for some years until he realized that what his white evangelical church was preaching was not the way of Jesus, but rather a false white gospel, which had very little to do with the way of Jesus portrayed in the Gospels. A false white gospel that rejected the way of radical inclusivity and love and justice for all, while clinging to systems and beliefs that perpetuated their perceived ethno-cultural interests and power. Wallis came to see that this false white gospel left out almost all of the teachings on justice in the Bible. and ignored Jesus' teachings about bringing good news to the poor, liberating the oppressed, making peace, and caring for the most vulnerable among us. In fact, at one point, Jim Wallis, with some other folks, decided to look in the Bible for all of the passages in the Bible that addressed issues of poverty and justice. They found over 2,000 passages in the Bible addressing concerns of poverty and justice. And they ended up cutting out all of those passages to show just how much would be taken out of the Bible if you were to cut those passages out. It gave a new definition to the Holy Bible when they did that. And then eventually they put those verses back in the Bible and they highlighted them in orange and published a Poverty and Justice Bible to highlight those 2,000 passages in the Bible that address poverty and justice. These passages that white Christian nationalism so conveniently ignores. In reading the Bible, Wallis came to the conclusion that the problem was not with the way of Jesus, but rather with how others had co-opted and misused Jesus. As Wallis puts it in his book, quote, "Jesus is a victim of identity theft in America." And as others have noted, perhaps you've read the book about Jesus and John Wayne, others have noticed that we have recast Jesus much more in the image of John Wayne as a symbol of power and virtues of white America, rather than embracing the way of a radically inclusive prophet from Nazareth who was executed by the empire. The false white gospel ignores the prophetic power of Jesus, the prophetic power of the Hebrew prophets, in order to perpetuate the power and privilege of enforcing systems that support white supremacy. Wallis notes that in the past, supporters of slavery would simply delete all of the passages in the Bible about freedom, about liberation, about equality, to hide the prophetic message of the Bible from the persons whom they enslaved. And of course, they completely deleted the book of Exodus in the Bible that they provided for the persons whom they enslaved. Today, adherents of the false white gospel simply ignore these passages, or they spiritualize them in such a way that they lose their power to challenge the unjust systems in our society. The danger we're facing today is that adherents to the false white gospel have tremendous political power within our society. And they are now even openly identifying themselves as Christian nationalists. It is no wonder that Christian nationalists want to control what we learn about history, because history clearly shows us the dark, dangerous, and deadly places humanity is prone to go when it embraces all forms of religious nationalism. And it almost always brings tremendous harm, suffering, and even death to the most vulnerable among us. You know, the people Jesus and the Hebrew prophets so inconveniently say we should all be caring for. The least of these, the most vulnerable among us. The false white gospel of Christian nationalism fails to embrace those 2,000 passages in the Bible that express concern about poverty and justice. It also fails to embrace the Imago Dei vision of the Bible, that all persons are created in the image of God and therefore are of equal sacred worth. It fails to embrace that we are to love all of our neighbors, not just the ones who look like us or believe like we do. It fails to welcome the stranger, to truly care for the imprisoned and the sick, and to address the injustices that perpetuate the plight of the most vulnerable among us. For these reasons and more, it is a false white gospel, the false white gospel of white Christian nationalism. Given that white Christian nationalists appear to be willing to do almost anything to maintain and expand their power, including the use of threats of violence and the use of actual violence, and given that white Christian nationalists express a willingness to embrace autocracy and authoritarianism to hold on to power, Wallis sees it as being one of the greatest threats, perhaps the greatest threat, to a multicultural, multiracial, and multi-faith democracy. Wallis understands that many persons have left Christianity and Christian churches because of this false white gospel being so prevalent in American churches. He understands it. He understands why people would choose no religion over the false religion of white Christian nationalism. He does express hope, however, and this perhaps is not a surprise given that he himself identifies as a Christian. He expresses hope that persons might also choose better religion rather than no religion at all. The better religion that Wallis envisions embraces all that white Christian nationalism ignores and rejects. It celebrates the equal sacred worth of all person. It lifts up our moral responsibility to love all persons, even our enemies. It views nature as our community, not just a commodity to be used and consumed. It brings good news to the poor, liberation for the oppressed, and care and comfort for the most vulnerable. It sees faith and justice as being inseparable, and it calls on all persons to speak out against all forms of injustice and to resist the systems that perpetuate injustice. Given that Wallis is a Christian, it should come as no surprise that he believes that what he is describing, although I have a little bit of a concern about the language he uses here, but he believes that what he is describing is the true Christian faith, as opposed to the false white gospel. But he's quick to note that persons who orient themselves to religion differently share many of these same concerns. And he embraces fully the freedom of religion and also the freedom from religion if someone chooses that. He embraces this freedom of religion as a core component of preserving freedom for all persons within a pluralistic society. The way forward for Wallis is to reject the false white gospel for a better religion, for a better way of radical inclusivity and justice. You may note that in the early Christian church, one of the earliest Christian creeds and possibly also words for one of the early baptismal rites comes from Galatians, where it focuses on the fact that there is no male or female, no Jew or Greek, no slave or free. All persons are one in their belief in Christ. A vision for radical inclusivity as opposed to exclusion. Wallis does not mix words. He does not mix his words when he proclaims this. White Christianity is nothing less than an idolatry, the worship of a false god, the worship of whiteness. Whiteness, deliberately or unconsciously, becomes the real God to whom we offer allegiance. So what are we to do? What are we to do in relation to this false white gospel? Echoing the words of Martin Luther King Jr., Jim Wallis asked the question, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? His answer is that we are to resist the false white gospel wherever we see it, wherever we come across it. It's part of what he sees as a battle for the soul of our nation. We resist it through political participation, especially through preserving voting rights, rights that are currently coming under direct attack. We resist it in our religious communities by realizing that every justice issue is also a faith issue. Wallis reminds us that speaking up for justice issues, even doing so from the pulpit, is not a violation of the separation of church and state at all. Preserving freedom, preserving justice, and preserving the well-being of all people and the community of all life is a sacred duty to which we are all called at all times and in all places. We are not only called to reject the false white gospel of white Christian nationalism, we are also called to embrace a radically inclusive and just vision of beloved community. For Wallis, it's not just what we are against, it's also what we are for. And what he is for is a radically inclusive and just vision of beloved community. And he notes, and this is in closing, those of us who happen to be white, have an even greater responsibility to resist and speak out against the false white gospel for the sake of the beloved community. May we all have the compassion and the strength and the courage to do so. Our parting thought comes from Bell Hooks, from her work, All About Love. For me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed?